Dictator Putin allegedly showed African leaders a purportedly initial draft agreement with Ukraine during a meeting in St. Petersburg. According to him, the agreement was being prepared in Istanbul back in March 2022. Supposedly, the discussions revolved around a potential peace agreement, but Ukraine suddenly refused to engage in peace negotiations. This narrative was presented against the backdrop of African leaders' attempts to encourage Kiev to enter into negotiations. Now let's briefly discuss why Putin would do this and what his motives might be. My name is Alexei Pechi, and today is June 17th. Let's delve into this together. To begin with, the main news is that Russian dictator Putin assured the African delegation that his logic regarding the war with Ukraine is allegedly flawless from the perspective of international law and the United Nations Charter. Russian media reported on this today, and snippets of Putin's speech to the African delegations were even shared on Telegram channels. According to Putin, it was the Kiev regime that started this war in 2014, and according to Article 51 of the UN Charter, we had the right to provide assistance to the so-called republics, citing the right to self-defense. Putin stated that this logic, in his view and that of his colleagues and experts, is impeccable in terms of international law and the UN Charter. Thus, according to Putin's words, Russia allegedly had the right to recognize the independence of the occupied territories in Donetsk and Luhansk regions and create these quasi-republics, the LPR and DPR, in accordance with the provisions of the United Nations. Putin begins to twist international law to suit his own agenda. Let me quote another statement from him. These territories, namely parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, had the right to declare their independence. Therefore, we had the right to recognize it. We signed a treaty with them on friendship and cooperation in full compliance with the UN Charter. We had the right to provide them with assistance. Here, Putin is clearly distorting international law to his advantage and attempting to extricate himself. However, he also demonstrates his indifference to the fact that everyone sees through these falsehoods. Nevertheless, he will confidently continue to tell this story about how Ukraine allegedly started the war and how parts of an independent country can proclaim their independence. This raises the question, could Chechnya, or rather Ichkeria, Tatarstan, or other republics also consider doing the same? How will Putin respond in such a scenario? But here's the crucial point. Putin repeatedly emphasized that it was Ukraine, not Russia, that refused so-called peace negotiations. He claimed that Russia was ready for full-scale peace talks from day one, but Ukraine was unwilling to engage. Now the most interesting part is that Putin presented the African leaders with an allegedly initial draft agreement with Ukraine, which was being prepared in Istanbul in March 2022. According to his logic, preliminary signing may have already taken place. Of course, nobody has seen the full text of this agreement. Russian propaganda media only published the first page. So, was such an agreement ever in existence? I doubt it. There may have been some preliminary discussions since negotiations were taking place, but Putin insists that Ukraine took it at the last moment and refused. Moreover, he also talked about how Russia was supposedly legally evacuating children from Ukraine and had never opposed their reunification with their families, claiming that they were saving them from the Nazis and so on. Prior to this, Senegalese President Macky Sall, during a meeting with Putin, stated that a peaceful agreement between Russia and Ukraine should be based on the principles of the UN Charter. He also noted that dialogue is not an exclusive option, mentioning conditions such. Furthermore, this information occasion of the alleged release of this draft agreement is also necessary for Putin to show now that Russia's failure in this war is not because his army failed, not because the second army in the world collapsed, not because Ukraine, caused harm to good people with this occupier, but because he is returning to this phrase that we have not yet started anything. Russia is failing in this war because they were allegedly ready for peace at the beginning of this full-scale phase of the war. That's why they adhered to the idea of peace negotiations. But they always had to respond to some aggressive actions by Ukraine, so you understand the logic is just turned upside down. Plus, now it is easier for Putin to explain to Russia why they cannot reach Kyiv in 3 days. Furthermore, this information occasion with the alleged draft agreement with Ukraine, which was supposedly signed or almost signed in Istanbul in March 2022, is needed to try to further destabilize the situation inside Ukraine. Like, look Ukrainians, Russia was already ready to end the war in March 2022, but Zelensky stood against it. He disagreed. He decided to continue fighting. So, as if Putin still can't say anything negative about Zelensky. They are fighting against the powerful Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation. but he continues to impose the idea that they are innocent and peaceful. They didn't attack, they only responded to aggression. And here I repeat, not only in Ukraine, but this topic will boil, believe me. Unfortunately, there will be those who will start saying that not everything is so straightforward, that Zelensky is not telling everything. Putin showed the first page of the allegedly initial draft agreement with Ukraine, which was signed almost a year ago. But the question arises, if such a draft agreement with Ukraine, almost signed in Istanbul in March of this year, existed, why didn't Putin show it immediately? Well, let's assume the logic, yes, such a situation, almost signed, and then Ukraine says no, we are withdrawing from this negotiation track. I remind you why. Because then Bucha happened. So why didn't Putin come out and say, look, we almost had a ready project, but Ukraine refused? Well, the logic is that those negotiations were needed for Putin to prolong this war. He really hoped to deceive the Ukrainians a little, to cloud the process. And during that time, as you remember, the Russian invasion of Ukraine continued in several directions. When they were negotiating in Istanbul, he needed to buy time, as Zelensky mentioned today. Putin is trying again to resort to the banal attempts to talk away the problem. He is trying to impose some conditional Minsk agreements, not for the sake of results, but for the sake of the process itself. And Putin is trying again to take a pause, to talk about something for years, to solve something, and so on. And it is important to understand that when negotiations were taking place in Istanbul, when Russian envoys, if you remember, there was such a person as Medinsky, started talking about some progress in the negotiations, he was simply removed from the information field. Have you seen him? After those negotiations, have you heard anything about a person like Medinsky? That's the person who came out and said against the backdrop of a stone wall that Russia is acting in good faith and leaving the north of Ukraine. After that Medinsky, he is nowhere to be found. Furthermore, remember Sergei Surkov's statement in February 2023. He explicitly stated that the Minsk agreements were never intended to be implemented. Surkov, who was the former assistant to the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, stated that the Minsk agreements were designed in such a way that they would be impossible to fulfill. They were deliberately created to buy time. I remind you that Surkov was the so-called curator of the Ukrainian direction in the Kremlin for a long time and was considered the ideologist behind a significant part of Russian policy towards Ukraine. In February, when asked about his work on the Minsk agreements and whether he expected them to be implemented, Surkov replied, no. Additionally, when questioned about his satisfaction with the expansion of Russia's western borders, he responded positively, and he believed that the actions of the Russian army were effective. Furthermore, the former assistant to Putin expressed confidence that Russia's relations with the West would normalize in the foreseeable future. They played with Moldova before, using the Minsk agreements as a tool that would never be realized. But now we are at war, and we are attempting to capture Ukraine. And if it works out, where will the West go? They might just start normalizing relations with Russia again, where Surkov, I don't know, maybe you've heard, but lately, I haven't heard much about him. It's like the Kremlin is keeping him in the shadows a bit because, once again, the attempts that Putin is making now to sit Kiev down at the negotiating table are a repetition of the same situation with the Minsk agreements. It's an attempt to buy time. It's an attempt to create an agreement that cannot be implemented in the future. Once again, Putin needs negotiations for the sake of the process, not the result. Let me summarize. Putin is currently trying to sell the same thing to Ukraine. Moreover, let's go back to the African leaders who visited Kiev and then went to Moscow. It is through them that Putin is transmitting all this nonsense about the initialing of a draft treaty, claiming that their entire war against Ukraine complies with the UN Charter, and so on. Remove the African leaders from the equation, and there is no reason to tell all this. So now Putin is also trying to, deflect some blame from his own circle. Because his own circle looks and understands that for a year and a half there has been almost full-scale war, and they got involved in this war. And now the counter-offensive by the Ukrainian armed forces shows that they are gradually being pushed back from Ukrainian territory. So where are the results? What is the purpose of all this? Putin needs to somehow alleviate some of the blame and show that he actually understands perfectly well what he is doing. Everything is going according to plan, and let's say, cool down a bit the dissatisfaction that was there. Why am I saying this? Just think about it. African leaders, in particular, the President of the Republic of South Africa, Ramaphosa, he is promoting the idea of suspending or even lifting the arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for Putin's abduction of children from Ukraine and their transportation to Russia. Furthermore, African leaders are proposing that we agree to partially lift sanctions on Russia. Well, nobody will lift sanctions, that's obvious, and it has been discussed several times in the West that even after the war ends, it is unlikely that they will be lifted in the near future. So why these proposals? Lifting the arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court and lifting sanctions. These are two options on the scale. No. Let's suspend the arrest warrant on Putin now because the President of the Republic of South Africa understands perfectly well that he will have the BRICS summit in the fall, and he really wants to hold it. He is looking for ways to bring Putin there. Or rather, not drag him there, but find a way for Putin to attend without the need for an arrest based on the warrant. And if hypothetically someone agrees to suspend the arrest warrant for Putin, he will get a window of opportunity. And then, if negotiations start to emerge hypothetically, Putin will have this window of time in which he supposedly engages in negotiations, but attends the BRICS summit, shaking hands with all the participants, showing that he is not an outcast. Yes, the West doesn't like him, but there are countries that do. President of Algeria, for example, gave a significant speech at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. So he needs to show that he is not an outcast and that he still has some influence. And after that, when the pressure on Putin's Russian circle eases and the claims against him decrease, the Russian army will have a chance to rest and regroup. Then, it will be possible to forget about negotiations again, just like with the Minsk agreements. That's why Putin is trying to inject this idea into the information space now. This thesis that allegedly in March 2022, a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia was almost signed. And I remind you that back then, Putin was pushing the idea that Ukraine would receive some security guarantees from Russia, but in return Ukraine had to establish a neutral status in its constitution, give up Crimea, Donbass, and so on. Well, I can't even hypothetically consider that such a draft agreement was actually initialed. Now Putin needs to buy time. And he is trying to do so in every way possible, while also sowing doubts among our Western partners and not only the Western ones. But I sincerely hope that, as always, all these attempts by Putin will fail. So here I'll put an ellipsis. That's the sketch that came up late at night. Now I ask you to like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Alexei Pechi, that's such a poetic name. Write your opinion in the comments. Perhaps you have your own theories about why he revealed this project. And if you consider my work important and necessary, you can support my YouTube channel by becoming a sponsor on the YouTube platform by clicking the sponsor button. Or you can make any donation using the links in the description. Glory to Ukraine.